Welcome back to Time for an Awakening, and before we get started this evening, I want to thank some of the listening audience that came out to Deliverance Evangelistic Church yesterday. We had the black farmers up for their scheduled health fair. The church had a health fair there, and they asked me to bring some of the farmers in that came in from Virginia with some of their winter crop. And I want to thank the listening audience, some of the listening audience that came out and not only participated in the health fair, but patronized our farmers. If we don't help our farmers, then they won't get help. We need to be out there for our farmers and for all black businesses. Support black businesses every chance you get, every opportunity you get to recycle our dollars. We should always do so. Brother Reg will be joining us shortly. Brother Ralph is on the line with us.
Hey, how you doing, Brother Bo?
How are you, sir?
Oh, I'm fine.
And tonight, we're scheduled to have with us to join us in conversation historian, researcher, educator, anthropologist, Dr. Runoko Rashidi will be joining us. He may be with us already. Dr. Rashidi?
Yes, I'm here.
How are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Brother Reg will be joining us momentarily, but we're on with Brother Ralph.
Hey, how you doing, Dr. Rashidi?
Hotel.
You know, before we get started this evening, I just want to say to our guests, you know, every time we have him on, I say the same thing to him in the beginning. I just want to thank him for his work, his travels. He travels the world, not only documenting our people, but the scattered members of our people that's among other folks. He goes in, looks for our people where they are. He don't stay in five-star hotels. He goes right to where our people are, stays with them, shares their stories, documents the evidence, and comes back and shares these things with us. I want to thank you again for your work, Dr. Rashidi, and what you do.
All right, but I need to nip some of that in the bud. I love five-star hotels. If I can afford it, I'd stay in one every time. There's nothing wrong with being comfortable, but I love what I do.
Okay.
And I've now been to 105 countries with a few more on the horizon. I've lectured in 60 countries, and that's quite a remarkable achievement. I think that if I wanted to toot my horn the most, what I would say is that most of that travel has come with very, very limited resources. You know, I'm not affiliated with a university.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's footing the bill. It comes from the sale of books and DVDs and lectures and scraping. And it just shows what you can accomplish if you have a vision and if you have a will, if you believe that the ancestors have your back, and if you believe you have a mission. And I certainly do believe all those things.
You know, before we get started with our topic this evening, 3 questions, Dr. Rashidi. Where have you been? What did you see? And when did you get back?
All right, well, it's been a while since I've been on the show.
Yes, it has.
And I guess that covers a lot of ground. Excuse me, it's Black History Month 2015 now, so I'm doing a lot of domestic travel. But in terms of international travel, or travel out of the U.S., most recently, some of the countries that I've been to are, I took a group to Cameroon in December. I'd always wanted to go there. That made African country number 29 for me. Very, very interesting.
Oh, boy. I think we lost.
I've been.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, one of the rare places that I've been where Africans control most of the businesses. That's so rare. But in Cameroon, most of the hotels, the stores, and what have you are owned by Africans, especially a group called the Bamileke. And then also, while I was there, visited a group called the Bajale. And this is a group of so-called pygmies there. They have different names. In Central Africa, sometimes they're called Batwa. In other parts of Cameroon, some of them are called Baka. So I was able to spend some time with them. And then, you know, a lot of time in France. My daughter lives there. The great museums are there. A lot of African artifacts are there. But one of the most interesting experiences I've had recently was in Athens. Now, as much as I hunt these African communities down, I really, really spend a lot of time in the museums, looking for African artifacts. It's a fascinating experience, and I've been to Greece twice before.
Mm-hmm.
The first time, the National Museum, I think it's the Archaeology Museum, was closed. It was being renovated for the Olympic Games. And then the next time I went, the museum was open, but the Egyptian section was closed, and what was called the Bronze Age collection was closed. So sure enough, I thought, since I had to pass on the way back from Cameroon back to Istanbul, Turkey, and then go to France, I would stop in Athens, and I got a 5-star hotel. I stayed right across the street from the Parthenon, this ancient Greek building. And one morning, Sunday morning, sure enough, I went to the museum, and the museum was open. This building is over 100 years old. And, the Greeks spent a lot of time in Africa, especially Kemet, so I just assumed there would be a lot of good stuff in there. So I get there, I wander through the museum, and I find a few nice artifacts. And I get to the Egyptian section, and sure enough, it's closed. It's a big iron door closing the section. And I was so disappointed. I'm thinking maybe this is the 3 strikes law. Maybe it's not my destiny to ever see this. So I expressed my disappointment to a couple people in the museum. And somebody said, a white woman, well, hold on a minute. Just have a seat if you like. And I sat down, and she made a phone call. She says, no promises, just have a seat. And sure enough, within about 10 minutes or so, a guy comes, white guy, naturally, with a big set of keys and opens up the Egyptian section. He doesn't let anybody else in there but me. He closes the door behind me, turns on the light, and says, okay, here you are. Wander at your leisure. Take all the pictures you want. And I was able to go through the Egyptian and the African section and the Roman parts of the museum. Just me. I've never had an experience like that before. This is not a little tiny museum in a out-of-the-way city somewhere. This is the National Museum of Greece. And I was able to have carte blanche, took a lot of pictures, and that, if the ancestors weren't with me that day, I don't know what else to attribute it to. I've never had an experience like that. Recently, I've been in Colombia, lecturing among African Colombians. Colombia is significant because it has the largest concentration of Africans in the Hispanic world. And these Africans were hungry for knowledge of self. Lectures that were just really, really, really well received. And my 2 most recent books on Asia and Europe are now being translated into Spanish. Lectures in not Trinidad, but Barbados, Guyana. I've been very, very active, and some of the experiences have been extremely rewarding. So in a nutshell, those are some of the places that I've been since I've been on your show last.
The topic that we're going to talk about this evening, or one of the topics, is the history of rebellion by African people against European domination. And before we get started with that topic, I want to kind of preference it with this. In Ferguson, when young people were met with the violent response to peaceful protests late last year, there was a debate among circles in the African-American community about whether we should respond violently. With stuff thrown around about the young people who were rioting and this, that, and the other. And it was, it was brought up again about the nonviolent movement of the 60s, and that's the way for our people to meet any resistance. I'm glad that you're on this evening tonight, Dr. Rashidi, to give us a historical perspective of our people's response to abusers of our ancestors, and whether it was always nonviolent, which I know that it wasn't. But I'm kind of glad that you're on tonight, and we're going to kind of take it from the continent and bring it over to the Americas, whether South America, Central America, and North America, maybe for last. But let's start on the continent, and maybe a good area to start, but you tell me. I heard you on a YouTube video talk about the Zanj rebellion. That's one I didn't know really much about, and I don't think our listening audience knows much about the captivity of our people that went further east. I think that it was Arabs that took our people into what is now Iran and Iraq. But to talk about that the rebellion, maybe we can start it off with that, Dr. Rashid.
No, I don't want to start with that. I want to preface it with
Go ahead.
A response to your remarks, and then we can go there.
Okay.
First of all, resistance takes many different forms. It could take something as innocuous as showing up late. And I think this whole notion of CP time is a form of resistance that was that came out of enslavement.
Okay.
That Africans engaged in different kinds of resistance. Okay, so that's one thing, and I think the form of resistance is dictated by the situation that we find ourselves in. I think it's very important to say that. Number two, we never want to start with enslavement. Never. I realize it's important, and I'm going to talk about the Zanj rebellion.
Okay.
But we don't want to start with that.
Okay.
Because I would argue that the worst crime you can commit is to teach a child that their history begins with enslavement. So we don't want to imply, even in the most innocent form, that our history begins there. So if we wanted to talk about ancient African resistance, one of the things we could talk about, and in fact where I would start, would be the resistance to the people called the Hyksos.
Okay.
The Hyksos, or the rulers of foreign lands, are the first known invaders of Africa. And they come to us about 3600 BC. The African family couldn't keep it together. And so an armed group of invaders called the Hyksos invade the country and stay there for about 150 years. The Africans call this period the Age of National Humiliation. And the people who form what we call the 18th dynasty of Kemet, or the 18th royal family, more or less expel them. And they're led by people like Amos the First and Tetisheri, because a lot of African women were involved. Amos and Second and Ra and Kamos and Amos Nefertari and Amos the First. And they inaugurate a new golden age. In fact, the 18th dynasty has been called the greatest royal family to ever mount a throne. So I wanted to begin with there. But much later...
but before you leave that, Dr. Rashidi, these Hyksos, what type of people were they, according to some of the documented evidence you have found?
You know, there aren't, to my knowledge, I don't know if there are any depictions of them.
Okay.
I think that they were so hated by the people of Kemet that they destroyed all the representations of them. Or maybe they just never had any representations in art because they were such an insignificant people who contributed virtually nothing to Kemet itself.
Okay.
But as far as we know, if we had to describe them, they would be, I would describe them like the people of, let's say, Syria today, or the people of Iraq, or parts of Turkey, non-African people.
Okay.
An Indo-European element, probably some blondes among them, but a lot of them would have looked, I think, to some extent like our typical perception of Arabs. They were not African people. That much we know. They were foreign invaders of Africa.
Okay.
And then, nearly, I'd say 2,500 years later, now let's just give the framework. About 640 or so, the Arabs in history, began a series of jihads, and part of that leads to the subduing of parts of Africa. And this is, if we look at the history of Africa and Islam, there's a very integral relationship. Muhammad sent his closest companions, peace be upon him, sent his closest companions to Africa, to Ethiopia. He was told, if you look to Ethiopia, there you will find a land of righteousness ruled by a king under whom no man is persecuted. It is a land where God will bring you rest from all of your afflictions. And the earliest Muslims, the companions of the Prophet, went there. And they were so hospitably received that later on the Prophet is supposed to have said, he who brings an Ethiopian woman or an Ethiopian man into his house brings the blessings of God there. We know the role of Bilal, one of the great African Muslims who was tortured for his faith, an Ethiopian, an African, who became so close to the Prophet Muhammad that he became known as the third of the faith. Muhammad is supposed to have told Bilal, last night I dreamed that I went to paradise, and I found that you had been there before me. But over a period of time, Africans are captured in these jihads by the Arabs, and some of them are taken as captive people to what is now southern Iraq. And between the 7th and the 9th centuries, these Africans engaged in 3 massive rebellions. They are called, the biggest one, which lasted from 868 to 883, is called the Revolt of the Zanj. The word Zanj can still be found in the island of Zanzibar today. And these are the captured Africans who were taken to Iraq and treated in a very, very brutal fashion. This is the largest revolt of enslaved human beings in history. It's bigger than the revolt of Spartacus, and it might surprise us to know it's bigger than the Haitian Revolution. Some of these Africans actually marched on Baghdad. and many of their descendants are still in southern Iraq today. It's a magnificent story of courage and resistance, and it's an African story, and it's a story that needs to be told.
Dr. Rashid, let's. I heard you earlier talk about, and not earlier on this program, earlier in other discussions, I've heard you talk about the Dravidians in India. And, you know, a lot of people are involved in different religions now. And, you know, some of our people are involved in Krishna. But I was surprised to understand and to know from you that one of the earliest resistance was by an African named Krishna, who I think that the aspects of the religion was based on. Talk about the Dravidians and Krishna, how he fought the invaders.
Well, you know, African people are the first people everywhere, that humanity begins in Africa. And we should dismiss this nonsense from the beginning that people keep repeating that Africa is named after a Roman general. That's just silly, and it's an insult. The Roman general was named after Africa. So Africa is the birthplace of humanity, and those ancient Africans, these black people, migrate from Africa all over the world. And the Indus Valley, what is now Pakistan and India, is no exception to that. And the people who built the great civilization of the Indus Valley, South Asia, are called the Dravidians. Now, the Romans and the Greeks refer to these people as Eastern Ethiopians, not the Ethiopia of today, but the word Ethiopia itself is a Greek word, which means the land of the burnt-faced people. And these are black people in South Asia with straight hair, naturally straight hair. And they built this great civilization, and just like the Hyksos invaded the Hyksos invaded Kemet, the Aryans related to the Hyksos invaded South Asia. They were drawn to the wealth of these fabulous cities built by black people, and combined with earthquakes and the disruption of the Indus River, these Africans were eventually scattered. And the people who took over were white people that we call Aryans, and the Dravidians resisted them. Now, you have one figure in particular called Krishna, and Krishna may have been a mythical figure, kind of like a Moses or an Osiris or something. We don't know if he was real. Perhaps there's a kernel of truth to him. The name Krishna means the black one, and he personifies the resistance of black people in South Asia to the people called the Aryans. And he resists the imposition of this racist, color-coded system that we call the caste system, which is the basis of Hinduism. Eventually, the people who were subdued the most, or I guess the greatest victims of Hinduism, are these Aryan invasions of India, which many people are attempting to deny now, would be the people called the Dalits or the Untouchables. And these were the descendants of the people who were victimized the most as a result of those invasions. Some people would refer to the Dalits or the Untouchables or outcasts of India as Adi Dravida or pre-Dravidians, and that even before the Dravidians themselves, they come closest to constituting the indigenous population of India. So it's a fascinating story, and it's a story also, like the Zanj rebellion, that doesn't get told very, very much, and so that many people are not even aware that you have black people in India. You know, when I do presentations, a lot of the time I focus on what are called the invisible people. Africans in Palestine, for example. Do you know that there was a Black Panther Party among the Palestinians? That there are black people in Palestine. Same thing in India. There's a Dalit Panther Party. You talk about resistance. You have a group of black people, a group of untouchables, or Dalits they are called, who named their principal organization after the Black Panthers of the United States. So these are very, very powerful forms of resistance. I know you didn't ask me, but let me introduce two other elements. Mm-hmm. You also have a Black Panther Party in Australia. I'm in Los Angeles now, and the Pan-African Film Festival is going on, and there's a film tomorrow called Black Panther Woman, and it's about a sister, an indigenous sister in Australia, who was a part of the Black Panther movement. You had a Garvey movement in Australia. Can you believe that? That Marcus Garvey had actually planned to visit Australia before he was railroaded by J. Edgar Hoover. That Amy Jakes Garvey kept in contact with indigenous Aboriginal leaders. And I say that because Australia is the next big country I'm going to go to. And then you have the South Pacific itself, where you have a history of Africans black people who were enslaved, We don't know much about their resistance, but all of these things open up new chapters in terms of researches that our people need to participate in. I would say that most of the history of African people has still not been written, and it should be written from the perspective of resistance to oppression, resistance to injustice, the idea that we were not just victims, but African people always fought to maintain their basic humanity from the most ancient times, and that resistance continues, as you know, until today.
Dr. Rashidi, our women were always prominent during European incursions and invasions on the continent. Talk about some of our women that fought European invasions into the continent to enslave some of our ancestors.
Well, there were many of them. We've already started talking about the Hyksos invasion and occupation, and there you have sisters in the struggle named Tetisheri. You have a sister named Amos, a sister named Amos Nefertari. These are women who were active participants in the liberation struggle of our people and are regarded as heroic figures in the history of Kemet. But later on, you have women like Al-Kahina. This is another very mysterious figure who lived in probably what is now Algeria, who was a Berber, or the people that the Greeks were to call and the Romans were to call Moors. The word Moor is a European term that means black. It means scorched. And this is where the word Moor comes from. It comes out of a European lexicon. And the Moorish resistance, or African resistance to the Arab invasion of Africa, is most personified by a woman called Al-Kahina, A-L-K-A-H-I-N-A. And that may not have been her name. It may have been something like a title. She was a kind of a prophetess. And she led a scorched earth policy against the Arab invasions of North Africa around 1,300 years ago, 1,325 years ago, because her sons participated in the Moorish incursions into Spain in 711. So Al-Kahina is a very, very important figure. And then you have the most famous of them all, and of course that's Nzinga, who is an African woman born in what is now Angola. She lived in Central Africa. She's born around 1550, and she is the person who most clearly personifies African resistance to the Portuguese invasion of Africans. She actually is a Pan-Africanist. She tries to build a coalition of African armies in Central Africa to eject the Portuguese. She is truly a warrior queen. So you have a lot of them. There's a sister in Ethiopia named Judith, sometimes called Judith the Fire. But certainly Al-Kahina, the women who were involved in the Hyksos resistance, in Nzinga, they're very, very prominent figures in our history. And I think that we would know more about them if we hadn't developed such a patriarchal attitude where history becomes his story and women are more or less written out of it. And I think we have a duty as historians to not only include the role of women, not only include the role of people of color in general, and Africans in particular, but especially the role of women who have pretty much been left out of the history books.
Before I just wanted to track on what you just said. Do you think, in your historical opinion, Dr. Rashidi, that comes from a European influence or European values being pushed on our people?
I do indeed. You know, if you look historically, I would say, and other people might take issue with this, but it's been argued that in the earliest form, God was identified in a feminine form. And I cannot argue with that. And then certainly you have women like, for example, here's another figure that is kind of, also she may be more legendary, and the role of several women may be combined into one, and this is the Kintaka, or Queen Mothers. The Romans would have called these women Candace. There's a tradition that one of them organized a huge army in what is now the Sudan and fronted off Alexander the Greek, preventing him from invading deep in Africa. One of them is supposed to have fought the Romans and actually marched back into Kemet from Kush and took over the temple of Aset on the island of Philae. And so the role of women, I think, has been very, very pronounced in African history. In fact, it is said that the worst thing you could do was to disrespect your mother. And so I think that women have, we begin to look at history from a Eurocentric perspective, And since Europe is such a patriarchal society, you know, this is where the idea of might makes right comes from, that a dog is a man's best friend, that a woman was more or less dependent on the male. But in Kemet, in ancient Egypt, a woman could will and inherit fortune. She could bring suits to the courts of law. There's no record in the history of Kemet that I'm aware of, not one incident of sexual assault, of rape. And I think in fact, in Kemet, the line of descent is traced to the female side of the family. So in Africa, traditionally, women played very, very prominent roles. But with the subjugation of Africa by the Arabs and Europeans, of course, that's been reversed.
Okay. Dr. Rashidi, before we move off the continent and come further west to the land of our diaspora, I in my limited research, I ran across the name Nzinga being used several times for both men and women in the resistance. It was one king that I ran across named Nzinga, but he was also called Alfonso I. Do you know anything about him? I think he was in the Congo.
I just know the name Alfonso I.
Okay.
I know that he comes, if I'm not mistaken, in the period just after Nzinga. If I'm not mistaken, perhaps during the same time period. But I don't know much about him.
Okay.
I know there's a beautiful icon of him or cameo of him in the BBF, the French National Library in Paris. But there's a lot of information about him. Certainly Jay Rogers writes about him in World's Great Men of Color. And it wouldn't be hard for people to do a little research. And that's something that I want to encourage. We just don't want to be, at least this is how I feel, I don't want to just spoon feed our people all the time. I want to create in our people the desire to want to know, the desire to want to dig and do a little research. I think if we were to have a criticism of our people, and there are many that we could have, I think that there's a sense of that it's up to other people to do our research for us. I think that's why that we seek for people to tell us what to think, how to feel, how to react. We look for a kind of a messiah on many different levels, whether it be in the form of scholarship or leadership in the community and what have you. So we want to encourage people to want to go and do research, to go and dig a little bit about the things that we're talking about. And certainly there's a lot of information on Alfonso, but I'm not in any way an expert on him.
Okay. Before we came, our people came to these shores, we spent time in a lot of these dungeons that I don't think the English built many of them. They were built by Spaniards and Portuguese. Am I right, Dr. Rashidi?
Certainly the Portuguese were big.
Okay.
And then, of course, you have the Dutch. A lot of times they get left out. And which reminds me of another resistance story I hope to come back to. And then, of course, you do have the Spanish, but you have the French. We can't leave them out. But certainly the Portuguese were, I think, the first big Europeans in the modern sense who were involved in enslavement in Africa. In fact, I think one of the biggest dungeons that you have, which is called El Mina, is a Portuguese word which means the mines. And this is one of the big dungeons along with Cape Coast Dungeon in Ghana.
You visited these sites, and you've documented dungeons for both men, women, where they separated them, and children. Talk about what you've seen and the horrors of how our people were housed in these places, these hellish conditions.
I've been to about 6 or 7 of them. I've been to El Mina and Cape Coast, each one a few times, and they're horrible. And then there's I've been to Gorée Island in Senegal. That's where you have the infants dungeon. So you had a dungeon for men, you had a dungeon for women. You always have that. The men and the women were separated. And you also had a dungeon, interestingly enough, for skinny people. You know, they wanted to fatten you up. So they had a special dungeon where you would be force-fed. But in Gorée Island, I've been in it, taking photographs of it. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't believe it. An infants dungeon. So, I mean, if you want to talk about the horrors, think about that. You're in the men's dungeon. You've been beaten and bruised and battered. You're in shackles. You're in a stinking hole. It's hot. There's no electricity. There's no toilets. There's no ventilation. You've been branded probably already like an animal. and then your wife, your mother, your daughter, your sister, your grandmother, your auntie, your niece is in the women's dungeon. And I don't have to paint a graphic picture of what might have happened in those women's dungeons and how our ancestors were abused and exploited.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the distance, you can hear your child calling you, Daddy, Mama, come get me. I'm cold. I'm scared. I'm hungry. Where are you? And this went on for so long that it became a way of life. And you have different ones. You have, for example, in Benin, a place called Ouida that I've been to a couple of times. And Ouida wasn't so much a dungeon, but a fortress. And this is where the enslaved Africans, the captured Africans, were kept. And then they would be awakened up 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning with no advance notice, and they would be forced to march to the sea about 5 miles away. And along the way, you'd march around what is called the Tree of Forgetfulness. I think you had to march around this tree 7 times. You were supposed to forget everything in your past life and prepare yourself to be an enslaved person. And then in Tunisia, I've been to a place called Kebele. Now, again, we don't want to leave the Arabs out in their role in softening up Africa for the Europeans. Kebele is in southern Tunisia, and I was told that Africans were force-marched there from as far away as Mali and Senegal. And there they would be sold to the Turks during the time of the Ottoman Empire or other Europeans, or taken to other parts of the Arab world. So these are places of horror. They're places of memory. Most recently, I've been to Fort James, which is in the Gambia. And this is where Kunta Kinte is supposed to have been taken from. In fact, I was in a dungeon where he's supposed to have been kept.
Mm-hmm.
So these are pretty horrible places, but I highly recommend that Africans in the diaspora go to them. Just like we go to the pyramids, and we are inspired in Kemet by the Valley of the Kings and Karnak Temple and the pyramids and what have you. You can see what African people have accomplished, and therefore you get a sense of what we are capable of accomplishing. But it's also important to go in these dungeons, to go through the door of no return, to get a sense of what your ancestors went through. And then the power that comes from going back. It's a remarkable experience, my brother, to go back to Africa, to go back to some of the very places that our ancestors were taken from. That is perhaps the greatest form of resistance, the fact that we survived the hells of North, South, Central America, and the Caribbean, and that we, some of us at least, have gone back to the motherland with the idea of redeeming Africa and becoming strong again. I'll tell you another form of resistance. The greatest form of resistance is just marrying a black woman. I tell all the brothers that. A lot of times black people be talking about, I don't see race, and I don't see color, and we're all the same. And then we're horrified when we have a Mike Brown or an Eric Garner or Trayvon Martin, because we realize you cannot just put your head in the sand and say race doesn't exist when it's convenient. It's a reality. It's a reality, and we have to address that. And I think that picking a mate that's from our community, loving, honoring black women, is another form of resistance. Resistance isn't necessarily rocket science. It takes basic form. Spending your money with other black people, joining an organization of like-minded people, listening to your radio show, supporting your show. I mean, all of these things are forms of resistance that anybody can engage in. And I think that sometimes we miss the forest for the trees because we think that resistance is a form of rocket science. It doesn't just mean getting out there and going Nat Turner on somebody, although it's important that we recognize the Africans who led the rebellions, but resistance can take many different forms every day of our lives, and I think that it's something we need to be constantly reminded of.
I want to get Brother Reg and Brother Ralph involved, but let's come west. And you kind of lead me in this trek, Dr. Rashidi. The first enslavement of our ancestors started in the islands and then was in South America before it came to North America. Give me that how that went.
Well, you're asking me to talk a little, give you a synopsis of revolts in South America and the Caribbean?
Yes,
okay.
Because I'd like to save North America for last.
All right. Well, the resistance took place in Africa itself. Here's a research project. I'd like to have some people do some research on the Africans who attacked those dungeons. That should be a wonderful form of research. Africans who, like a lot of times people say, those Africans sold us. We don't owe Africa anything because the Africans sold my ancestors. A lot of people talk about that, and very few people who say it have done any real research.
Okay.
That's what you heard. We grew up hearing those Africans sold us, and a lot of us accept that almost instinctively. But if you're going to talk about that, you owe yourself, you have an obligation to talk about Africans who we know resisted enslavement in the motherland, who fought against it. That's number one. And then, of course, you know, the resistance took form on the ships. There were revolts, there were mutinies. The most famous one is the Amistad, but there were others. And then, of course, you have what are called the Maroon communities. And these are communities of Africans in the Americas who refused to accept enslavement, Africans who ran away, went into the bush, and established their own communities. Now, the greatest of these communities, or one of the most significant anyway, is Palmares in Brazil, which lasted for 100 years. This African community in the interior of Brazil, enslaved Africans, lasted from 1698 to 1798. For 100 years, it couldn't be cracked, and the greatest leader is a man named Zumbi, sometimes called Zumbi dos Palmares. And then you have that all over South America. You have Maroon communities in Colombia, in Peru, in Bolivia. Some of the greatest of the Maroon fighters came from Suriname. The Dutch were probably the cruelest of the slavers. And Suriname is a former Dutch colony in South America. And you have a number of Maroons. You have, for example, we're talking about sisters again, a sister named Alida in Suriname. Alida was a beautiful African woman. I think all African women are beautiful. And she was abused by her, or desired at least, by the slave owner. And the slave owner's wife got wind of it. And one day, after the slave owner had been in the field, she said, the white wife, she said, go look in the kitchen. I've got your favorite dish. And he looked in a pot, and there was one of Alida's breast cooking in the pot. Somehow the sister survived and went into the bush and bore 3 children. And the greatest of them was a man named Boney, who was the greatest, in my opinion, resistance fighter in the history of Suriname. And his followers became known as Boney Negers. Now, one of the things about the Maroons is that over a period of time, and this happened particularly in Jamaica and Mexico, so much pressure was brought to bear on them that some of the Maroon leaders sold out. And they signed treaties with the slavers, saying essentially that we will grant you your freedom, but from now on, any Africans who escaped from the plantations and haciendas would have to be returned. And some Africans signed those treaties. Boney refused to do that. Just like in Jamaica, Nanny refused to do that. So you have these heroic figures in the Maroon communities. You have another outstanding Maroon community in Mexico, led by a man named Caspar Yangam. One of my soon-to-be tours will be to Mexico, the African heritage in Mexico, and we're going to visit the community of Yanga, where there's a statue of this African resistance leader. So you have these Maroon communities all over the Americas. You have, of course, in the Caribbean, the Haitian Revolution, led by people like Christophe and Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Madame Felicity. A lot of times we don't talk about the African women in the Haitian Revolution. There's a sister in Haiti named Baina Bello that's done great work on African women in the Haitian Revolution. And so the important thing to emphasize is that resistance is a natural reaction to oppression and injustice. And like any people, Africans fought to keep the family together. They fought to maintain their basic human dignity. And it's a story, again, that needs to be told again and again and again. And we're going to talk about enslavement. Let's talk about resistance to enslavement.
Well, we're joined in conversation tonight by historian, researcher, educator, and anthropologist. The Dr. Runoko Rashidi is with us this evening. You can give us a call and join this conversation at 215-253-7263. That's 215-253-7263. Reg, before I go to you, let me take this call. Caller, what's your name? Where you calling from?
Yes, Brother Timothy, South Philly, calling from Philadelphia, sir.
How are you?
You have a great, renowned guest who's very learned and has traveled well, like you always do. But Dr. Rashidi, it's very interesting how Marcus Garvey's influences has hit the continent of Europe. It's been amazing to me. As a matter of fact, I know of a segregated ship during World War II with black soldiers and white officers. And when those white officers hit the shore of Europe, the first thing that they wanted to know when they went to a tavern about Marcus Garvey, they were very impressed with Marcus Garvey. His dress, his style, his organizing, and another person from Europe very impressed with Marcus Garvey, Mussolini. He copied the style, the organizing, and that look, that military style of Marcus Garvey. I also want to say to you, I'm familiar with the Dravidian people of the Indus Valley. And one reason I studied the Indus people of the Dravidian Valley because they had a strong period, 35,000 year period like we did in the Nile Valley. But one thing I want to ask you, sir, they were fighters. They were also peaceful people. They have a lot of good history about them. My question to you, did the European give them such a wicked thing called the caste system? Did that come from the European invaders giving them that in exchange for the Dravidian people trying to fight them off? I'd like to hear the answer on that.
Thank you, Brother Timothy, for your call.
Yeah, we talked about Dravidians earlier, so I won't spend a lot of time with them. The Dravidians are the people who built what we call the Indus Valley or Harappa civilization. And I guess it's comparable to Kemet or Sumer in Iraq, a black civilization in early Asian history. And they were overrun by the people that we call the Aryans or the Indo-Europeans. And they offered tremendous resistance, and as Brother Elliott pointed out, one of the figures that emerges from that is the man called Krishna. But Marcus Garvey lived in Europe. Marcus Garvey lived in London, died in London. I've actually been past the house where he lived in, and he gave speeches in Paris. And so Garvey was international. Garvey had chapters, as I mentioned, in Australia. And so the impact of Garvey is phenomenal. In fact, I guess it's important that we talk about Garvey as perhaps one of the high points of resistance in the Americas, and that this is now the 101st year of the foundation of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, of which I'm a member and officially the traveling ambassador for the UNINACL. So certainly Garvey was significant, and certainly the Dravidians played a very, very important role in black history.
Timothy also asked about the caste system. Was it started by the invaders?
Well, the caste system is the legacy of the Indo-European invasions or Aryan invasions of India. And it really parallels, but it has a religious foundation also. It's very, very similar to apartheid South Africa, where you have the whites on the top, you have what would be called the mixed races or coloreds in the middle, and then you have the masses of conquered black people on the bottom, and then outside of that you have the Dalits or the untouchables. The difference between, I think, apartheid in South Africa and the caste system in India is that it also has a religious foundation, and it's the foundation of Hinduism. You cannot have caste without Hinduism, and you can't have Hinduism without caste, because the caste system is the framework of Hinduism. It shows a hierarchy. Again, here it goes very quickly. According to Hindu scripture, the creator god is Brahma, and from the head of Brahma or the mouth of Brahma sprang the Brahmins identified with the color white, and from the shoulders or biceps of Brahma sprang the Kshatriyas or the Rajput, identified with the color red. They're the warriors. Brahmins are the priests, the intellectual aristocracy. And then underneath them are the Vaishya, the farmers and merchants identified with the color yellow, who, according to this tradition, sprang from the thighs of Brahma. And then from the feet of Brahma came the Sudras, identified with the color black, and they were the slaves of the other caste. And then outside of them were the slaves of the slaves, the outcasts or the untouchables. So all of this is a part of the Indo-European or Aryan legacy of invasion in India. So to answer your question, yes, it's fundamentally linked to those invasions of white people in ancient India.
Okay. 215, area code,
Yeah.
what's your name? Where you calling from?
Yeah, this is Mo, calling from North Philly.
How are you, Mo?
Yeah, I'm doing fine.
Mo, we got a little, can you turn your radio down in the back? I think we got a little interference. Or
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, also,
yeah.
Yeah, also, well, go ahead, Mo, because it's still a little interference.
Is that a little better?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, I got a question for in my read, I found that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, his mother was from Ethiopia. And you ever, your research...
I've never heard that about the Prophet Muhammad's mother. I have read, and it's written by a man named Al-Jahiz, a black man who wrote a book called The Book of the Glory of the Blacks Over the Whites, that Muhammad's grandfather was a black man. He is described as black as, I believe, black as the night and magnificent, some words to that effect. And he was the Sharif of Mecca. So on his father's side, he's a black man, not his mother's side.
Yeah, but his mother, I read that his mother was from Abyssinia, which is now Ethiopia today, right?
I've never read that.
Yeah, well I have read that. And even historian J. Rogers said that the Prophet Muhammad was a black man.
Yeah, well, I need to research that, my brother.
Yeah.
I never saw that reference, but I appreciate it, and I will follow up on it. Thank you.
Now, my question is, like, all that area, I thought that at one time, Turkey, Iraq, all of that, the original people of that area were black.
The original people everywhere were black.
Okay, where did they, how did they, what I'm trying to figure out, how did all of a sudden they become the Turks and the people from Iran and Iraq, the so-called Persian, how did they change colors? How long did it take for them to become white like that?
I think tens of thousands of years. Humanity comes out of Africa, black people. And they go into these northern parts of the world. They're affected by these ice age conditions. And over a period of time, they adapt and mutate. And this is where white people come from. White people are black people that got caught, well, formerly black people that got caught up in that ice and were transformed both physically and psychologically. There's only one race, and that's the human race, which has its roots in Africa.
Okay. So is that, the reason why I'm trying to figure out, let's like with Michael Jackson, that vitiligo. You said they suffered from that? That's how they became white, or?
I would guess something like that. I think if there's no sunshine and it's very frigid for thousands of years, you lose a lot of your melanin content. Now, I don't know if I would relate that to what Michael Jackson, the disease that he was suffering from, but I guess it must be something very similar to that. You know and I know that if you don't have any sunshine for a while, you become pale. If you're out in the sun for a long time, you get darker. Now, if you multiply that by tens of thousands of years, I think that you could see the possibilities of the transformation into what we call different racial groups and the emergence of white people.
Now, another question. With this, have you ever heard of a warrior, African warrior named Uthman Danfodio?
Yes.
Okay, exactly what country did he come from? The reason why I'm asking, like this whole concept that the Italians got called a mafia, right? Now, my understanding, they got that from the Moors or the Muslims when they went up into Europe. And that the word mafia itself is an Arabic word, not an Italian word. Now, can you break that down if you can?
You know, Italy, and especially Sicily, is very close to Africa. You can see Africa from Sicily. And I was just in Sicily a few months ago. Palermo, everybody I looked at, I'm looking at as if they're the Godfather or something like that. And both the Moors and the Arabs had a big influence on that part of the world, including the language. It wouldn't surprise me to know that if the mafia, the word, and maybe even the concept has some sort of North African roots. Danfodio comes from West Africa. I believe either from Senegal or Guinea. And again, that's a part of our history that needs to be studied a lot more. I think he would figure very actively in what we're talking about tonight in terms of African resistance to oppression. He is a warrior figure, as you know.
Okay. All right. Thank you, bro. I appreciate that.
Thank you for your contribution, Mo.
All right.
404 area code. What's your name? Where you calling from?
This is Brother Hugh Man out of Atlanta.
How are you, sir?
I'm doing good. Thank you for taking my call.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask Brother Rashidi if he could clear a couple of things up for me. I saw a think it was a documentary years ago by Brother Eugene Adams, and it was the early presence in Asia. And I was wondering if Brother Rashidi could clear up the name of those people, as I understood it in that, the name of the people in Southeast Asia who built the civilization known as Angkor Wat.
According to Angkor Wat is a building. It's a temple complex. And it's a part of the kingdom of Angkor. And the people who built the kingdom of Angkor are called Khmers. And the Khmers live in Cambodia. In fact, I'm taking a group to Cambodia in December before I get off the air, which is going to be soon, apparently. I'd like to leave my phone number and email address. People can contact me. But you're talking about the Khmers, talking about Cambodia, and the Khmers were the builders of the great kingdom of Angkor, which is the classical civilization, a black civilization in Southeast Asia.
Now, why did he referred to them as Nagar, the Nagar? And I never really understood that. You know, I never talked to anyone to get a clarification on it, so I was just wondering, you know, is it any validity to that, or?
Well, you do have the term Naga, N-A-G-A,
Naga, okay.
And it's a term that is used a lot in the history of Southeast Asia, India, Cambodia, Vietnam, and what have you. And remember now, this was an area that was dominated by black people at one time. Mm-hmm. You have the kingdom of Angkor in Cambodia, but in Vietnam you have the kingdom of Champa, and this is another black kingdom in central Vietnam. You have the name Naga that's associated with black populations in northeast India. But in terms of why he used that term, I guess you'd have to ask them that. I don't want to find myself in a position where I'm defending or advocating a position that I may not fully understand. But those are that's a little bit of information about the Naga and about the great kingdoms of Southeast Asia.
Okay, one other one that was referenced, as I understood, on another documentary made about the Egyptians in the temple of, I think it was the temple of Seti. We had the 4 different categories of man, and I think the last one was referred to as Tamahu. Was that ever an actual term used by the Egyptians?
Apparently so. Apparently so, and apparently it was a term that was applied to white populations in Libya and perhaps even Western Asia. Now, it's actually not a temple, it's a tomb, and it's a tomb of a man named Seti I, who is the father of the much more famous Ramses the Great. And there are 4 representations. There's a Cushite, or a Nubian, an African. There's a Kemite, an Egyptian, an African. There's what they call an Asiatic, which would have been like the Hyksos that we talked about at the beginning of the program. And you have the Libyans, these white nomadic types in North Africa. And what Seti attempted to do, or the people who painted that, was to show the distinctions in ethnic groups or human races as perceived by the people of Kemet at that time. And we're talking about 3,275 years ago in the 19th dynasty.
All right. Thank you, brother. And I really enjoy your show, man. I really enjoy the show.
Hey, thank you for your call. Call again.
All right.
Brother Reg, because I want to move on into, while we still have Dr. Rashidi, move on into some of the rebellions here in the continental United States. But, Brother Reg, jump in. I know you've been wanting to get in here. Brother Reg?
This is Brother Ralph Elliott.
Go ahead, Ralph.
And I really wanted to ask Dr. Rashidi about Bermuda. I'm planning on a trip there, and I've been doing a lot of research and reading, and come to find out there have been a lot of revolts and resistance right there in Bermuda to this very date. And I was researching the history of that island, and they said like they brought a lot of West Indians to Bermuda. And all of a sudden, the white population got a little fearful because the black population grew. I think it's like 63% of the island right now. Did you do any research on the island of Bermuda?
Yeah, a little bit. Bermuda is not in the Caribbean. That surprises a lot of people. It's not West Indian. It's in the North Atlantic.
Right.
And when you go there, my suggestion to you would be bring a lot of money. It's a very, very, very expensive place. Small island. In fact, it's probably a couple islands. The capital is Hamilton. And in Hamilton, you have a fairly new statue of a woman, I think it's made of bronze. It's right in front of the courthouse, of a woman named Sally Bassett.
Right.
Sally Bassett was an African woman who was burned at the stake by the British in around 1600. She was accused of giving poison to other enslaved Africans so that they could kill their master. She denied it, but on a blazing hot day around 1625 or so, this black woman was burned at the stake. And so Sally Bassett, I think more than anybody else, personifies African resistance in the Caribbean. And again, resistance takes different forms. Sometimes there were open, organized revolts, like people like Nat Turner, of course, we know about. But other times, enslaved African women put poison in the master's food, or did whatever they could, or they worked real slow, or they set fire to the master's house or to the master's crops. So resistance takes different forms, and I want to emphasize that. But in terms of Bermuda, Sally Bassett is the person that you want to follow up on. And there certainly was resistance there.
I appreciate that, sir. And now, my second question, you brought that up earlier. It was about the Moors. Now, I've read different things about the Moors. I know some people today that call themselves Moorish American. They have the so-called Moor card and all this. Now, I read where the Spanish used a word called Moro, and it was derogatory for Muslims. And then the English used the word Moors just to talk about, in a derogatory way, people of North Africa with you. But I read all these different things, and I want to get it from you, sir. What is the term Moor, what is, I know about Timothy Drew. I read up on Timothy Drew, Noble Drew Ali, and the Moorish Science Temple. And I believe that's where a lot of our folks are getting this from. But I just wanted to get it from you, sir. What that term again? Is it derogatory or what?
You mean the word Moro or Moor itself?
Well, they're saying they're one and the same. One is Spanish and one is English, but I really don't know. That's why I was asking you.
Well, I want to repeat that the word Moor comes out of the Greco-Roman world. First time we hear that term, it's applied to black populations in Northwest Africa, countries like Morocco, Mauritania, Algeria. This was considered the land of the Moors. And certainly the Romans talked about them a lot. The word Moor is used extensively in Roman literature about North Africa. So the word Moor is not an African word.
Okay.
I mean, we need to be very clear on that. Because many of the people I talk to who call themselves Moors reject the name Africa, and they go around repeating this foolishness that Africa is named after Roman general Scipio Africanus. That's really, really an insulting thing to say. And there's no evidence for that whatsoever. Scipio Africanus was a Roman general who engineered the defeat of the Carthaginians. And as a result of that, he was given the name Conqueror of Africa. So Africa is not named after a Roman general. A Roman general got his name from his relationship to Africa. So I want to be very, very, very clear on that, because I hear that all of the time, and it's nonsense, and it's an insult, and it's completely inaccurate. It's what we might call an urban myth. And so the word Moor, we find it extensively in the Roman world. You find the word Moor, and you also find the word Niger, N-I-G-E-R. Both of these words imply black or African. Now, the Moors, as you know, fought alongside the Carthaginians. They fought alongside Hannibal, and they were eventually, and the Carthaginian army was eventually defeated. So the Moors then fight in the Roman army, and then we find them fighting against the Arabs who invaded Africa, and then they convert to Islam, and they are at the forefront of the movement of Muslims into Spain in 710 and 711. And they occupy Spain for 1,000 years. They are in power in parts of Spain from 711 until 1492. And you have different movements that go into Spain at different times. For example, you have a group called the Almoravids, and then you have a group called the Almohads. So there's different groups of Moors. And part of the confusion is that there were not only Moors in Spain, but there were Arabs in Spain, some of whom were black and some of whom were not. Now, Shakespeare used the word Moor and Negro as synonyms. And over a period of time, after hundreds of years, the word Moor became almost universally used for black people in Europe. And so even the ancestor of Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin, Ibrahim Hannibal, is called the Moor of Peter the Great. But the word Moor itself, the name has changed, and it's come to mean different things at different times. For example, if you go today to the country called Mauritania, which still has the name Moor, the people who enslave Africans there today are called Moors.
Right.
You know, so the word Moor is very, very, very complex. And I think what a lot of people have done is simplify it. And a lot of times it comes just what is essentially anti-Africanism. So people will call themselves a Moor or a Hebrew Israelite or an Aboriginal American simply because they don't want to identify with Africa. They don't want to identify with enslavement. They may never tell you that. But a lot of it comes out of an anti-African bias that I have no tolerance for. And I think many who call themselves Moors don't understand that.
And you know what, Doc? You hit the nail right on the head, because a lot of these people, they will also deny that slavery existed in this country, like we were already here. So I've heard that urban legend before also, and there are a lot of folk out there that they're repeating this, and it gets to me sometime when I hear that. And one last thing, and Mo sort of hit the, asked one of the questions, and you answered it already, but I was reading where the early Persians were black, but you sort of answered that when you answered Mo's questions, that our people came off the continent and settled elsewhere and became mutated. So,
yeah. And you could say that about virtually the whole world. You could say that the first people of China were black. Or the first people in the Western Hemisphere were black people. People who came out of Africa. If we didn't know it before, we can trace it through DNA analysis. I think the problem is we are taught that Africa is the worst place there ever was. Africa is the jungle. Africa is where King Kong lives. Africa is where Tarzan hangs out. Africans is where people live in trees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This mythology that's very negative about Africa is ingrained in our minds. So many of us grasp almost anything so that we're not identified with Africa. How many times have we heard people say, thank God for slavery because it got us out of Africa? Or call me anything but an African. You know, I think a lot of us would rather be called turds in the toilet than African, because we are taught that Africa is a horrible place. And I think a lot of these people call themselves Moors are the victims of that. And they may not understand that, but it smacks of anti-Africanism, and the Hebrew Israelites are even worse. They are hostile to Africa, and I'm very offended by that.
Oh, boy. Brother Ed, jump in.
Yes. Dr. Rashidi, good evening.
Good evening.
I have a question to follow up with what Ralph just stated. I just want to have understanding. I've heard a term, blackamoor, was used toward. I know they have a lot of decorative art and figurines.
Exactly.
Was that termed primarily used to describe that type of artwork, or was it used at one point in time to describe a certain type of Moor?
It's a little bit of confusion about that, because you also have another word, and that word is tawny Moor. And so Ivan Van Sertima seemed to apply that, again, we're talking about a period of over 1,000 years of mixture in Europe. Those Moors who came into Spain in 711, led by people like Tarif and what have you, those were Moorish soldiers. They didn't have a lot of women. And so naturally, there would be some intermingling. Many of those Moors certainly would have intermarried with European women. And so over a period of time, you might have different kinds of them, just like you have different shades of African Americans. You have Ben Carson. I hate to use him as an example. Let's find somebody else, LeBron James, a darker brother. But you also have lighter-skinned black people. And let's face it, most of that comes from intermixture. It comes from a time, in this case, when black men could not protect black women. But in Europe, you have a kind of a mixture, I think a lot of which had to do with the fact that there weren't that many black women in Europe. And so over a period of time, the word blackamoor might have been applied to those who retained a lot of their original melanin content and African features, blackamoor. Whereas Tawny Moor might have been those who were Moors, in terms of culture, but who had physically were much lighter as a result of hundreds of years of being in Europe. And certainly the word blackamoor came to be used very, very extensively, I think, in the later phases of European history, 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, and that's when you see a lot of that artwork that you're talking about manifest itself.
And my follow-up question to you, I know that you've done extensive research regarding the Africans' presence throughout the world. And Elliot and I had a discussion in reference to someone that posted a message on the Facebook page, a reference, and let me start this way. I have a statement, and then I'll just give you a little bit more information.
I'm listening.
Our actions shape our identity, and in turn, our identity shapes our actions. This is something I posted on the page. And the reason I posted this on the page, you always speak about our glorious history, the things that Africans have done throughout the world. We know that in terms of our people, you had different people doing different things at different times, at different points in our history. If you were speaking to someone that didn't have any intellectual learning about our history, isn't it fair would it be a fair statement to tell them that we come from kings and queens, we come from people who originated languages, originated originated architecture and these things of the sort, or would it be something else that we should tell our people how we should look at our past and our history?
No, I would say that works for me. We can certainly say that we have kings and queens in our lineage.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think it's inaccurate to say that we came from kings and queens. Look, a lot of times when I mentioned earlier on, I'm very proud to say I've lectured in 60 countries now. That's a lot. And a lot of times I deal with people who are not very sophisticated about African history. And so to break the ice, I might start my program by saying, what do you think of when you think of Africa? Let's just get right down to it. And, because I want to engage the audience. And one person might say, whoa, Dr. Rashidi, when I think of Africa, I think of wild animals. That's valid. That's what we see on TV. We see the nature films. We see the herds of wildebeest and zebras and giraffes trying to keep from getting eaten by lions and hyenas and stuff. And then you see, and then the person says, I know, Dr. Rashidi, poverty. Because you see that. You see starvation, and you see babies with big bellies and can't get enough to eat. It's very sad. And the third thing that I get very consistently is disease, AIDS, malaria, and now Ebola. So we have an overwhelmingly negative image of Africa. And so I start to break that down. I say Africa is, it's where the first people came from. And Africa is where people first stood on 2 feet. And Africa is where people first wore clothes and had a house, not a hut, a house. Africa is where people first wore shoes. Africa is where people first charted the stars in the heavens and built a boat and buried the dead and played music and had art and so forth and so on. So I think it's important that, depending on who the audience is, we become very basic, because history has a propaganda value. Let's not lie about it. History is not just dates and facts and figures. It's life, and it's our life. And you can directly measure people's status in the world by the emphasis that they put on their history and culture. Strong people cram history down your throat. Weak people are told they don't have a history. That was a long time ago. I ain't got time for that. I need to be talking about how to put money in my pocket. What happened 1,000 years ago or yesterday, I ain't got time for. What's that got to do with me? And I think that, my brother, that you're doing the right thing, that you have to judge the audience, that there's nothing wrong with returning to the basics and talking about the things that a lot of us here on this show take for granted, or sometimes take for granted. And other times, if the audience is more sophisticated, you can be more nuanced in that. So you have to be a good judge of the audience.
And what I like to on that portion, on just the sophisticated audience, to me, we've had our history usurped, adapted, changed by other people. And my bone of contention with the people who are sophisticated is they have a problem with their own people, because within our race, we have people that are laborers, we have people that were illiterate. But on the flip side, you see European history, they've had those same type of things, but they always, when they go to teach their children, they're always teaching their children the best of the culture, so they have something to look up to build up. I think it's the same thing that we should do for ourselves, whether the children out there are walking around with their pants hanging down or not. Tell them they're from kings and queens, and maybe they'll change their behavior. That's just my premise, and I can't understand that, we have people that sometimes all they look at, I'm talking about people who are culturally sophisticated, conscious. Everything that you try to say, they're always looking for the negative piece on it so they can have an argument or to win an argument. And sometimes this brass tacks. It's like, it's a given that we had laborers. It's a given that we had people that are illiterate. It's a given that we had people that were thieves and robbers. But you have that, Europeans have that same history. But what are they promoting? They're promoting the best of their culture, whether it's fact or fiction.
Well, you get an argument from me there, brother. Preach is what I would say. I agree with you 100%. We want to feel good about ourselves. We want to have a sense that we contribute something positive to the world. We get enough of the negative, and we have to bend over backwards to counter that, because most of our history, I would say, is positive. We gave humanity to the world. We gave culture to the world, and we should be proud of that, and our people need to know about that. There's nothing wrong with feeling good about who you are, and having a sense of identity, and having a sense of, yes, my ancestors accomplished great things, and so therefore I am obligated to accomplish great things. And that's what history is all about. And anybody who says different than that is deluding themselves.
Let's go to Reggie. You all right?
I am done. I'm
Let's go to 215 area code. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Yes. How are you, brothers? Professor Rashidi, I heard
sorry, I cut you off there, but you got one more question. This is Timothy.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I was going to say, Professor Rashidi, I heard you open up early about a museum that you visited in Greece. And I was going to say to you that from my readings of Gerald Massey and Godfrey Higgins, he himself, as a European, has said some of the best stuff was stolen and brought to England. Have you ever been to the museums in England and compared them to Greece or Rome or wherever?
I have been to most of the major museums in the world. I'm not saying that to boast, but I have. And the British Museum is one of the best in existence. If white folks can't do anything else, well, it's steal. They can gather some stuff. In fact, I think museums are largely a European phenomenon. So the British Museum in London is magnificent. They got all kind of stuff in there, especially stuff from the Nile Valley. But I would say that the greatest museum in the world is the Louvre in Paris. It's a former palace, and they've got some of everything. You have Egyptian museums in Italy. You have at least 3 Egyptian museums in Germany. The Germans were among the first big European Egyptologists. And you could go from country to country. You could go from Switzerland. You could look at Sweden. You could look at Denmark. You could look at Scotland. You could look at all of these places and find African artifacts, particularly Egyptian artifacts, in these museums. So when we talk about reparations, that's one of the things we should be talking about, the regathering of our African artifacts. Reparations takes different forms. We were stolen, and a lot of our art was stolen, and it's in these museums right now. And I've had the pleasure of being in, as I say, virtually every major museum on earth in search of the African presence. And now the question is, what do I do with the information? I've collected so many thousands of original photographs. I'm an elder now, at least a young elder. I'm 60 years old. And so a question becomes, what do I do with it? How do I disseminate it? I'm not at a university, and certainly I don't want this information to pass away with me. And so one of the things that we should spend a lot of time talking about is the dissemination of the information, what we do with it, how we pass it along to the youth, intergenerational transmissions of wisdom. I think that's a very important subject. When a scholar passes and the information, their archives, their photos are scattered to the far corners of the earth, that's a sin. That's a crime against humanity, and we should seek to see that that never happens again.
Thank you very much for that, sir.
Thank you for.
I'm going to try to visit some of those museums.
Do that.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your call, sir.
Good. Thank you.
Dr. Rashidi, let's move to the continental United States where we got some more time. Let's talk about to start.
How much time do we have? I thought we were out of time.
No, we got some more time. we got at least another half hour we're going to be on. If you could stay with us.
Before we go anywhere else, let me just, so that people have it, let me give my contact information.
Go ahead.
That people can reach me. Of course, I prefer email. You can always email me at Runoko@hotmail.com. And Runoko is spelled Runoko. So you can reach me at Runoko@hotmail.com. And after the show, you could call me at area code 210-232-7272. That's 210-232-7272. And I have a new website, simple, easy to remember, RunokoRashidi.com. You can go there, get information about my tours. You can get my bio, et cetera, et cetera.
Can you purchase a lot of these DVDs and books from the site also?
Well, I'm putting it on there now. It's a brand new website, and so it's truly a work in progress. I do have free books available, a small travel book, my book, African Star, The Black Presence in the East, another book called Black Star, The African Presence in Early Europe, a number of DVDs. So if you don't see it on the website, again, a person can just email me directly, and I'll send you a list, and that I'll tell you how to get the information, and that is Runoko@hotmail.com.
We'll say that a couple more times before the program's over.
Yes.
Dr. Rashidi, let's start by talking about two of the largest that I've seen. Yeah, you're the historian in this country. The Stono Rebellion and also Andre's Rebellion in 1811 in Louisiana. From what I've seen, it doesn't have a particular person that spearheaded these rebellions that's why I want you to talk about them.
No, I can stop you right there. I'm not an expert on either of those.
Okay.
The Stono Rebellion, what is it? It's in North Carolina, right?
South Carolina.
South Carolina, and then you have another big rebellion in New York. I know that Africans marched on the city of New Orleans, and that was the thing that I think people need to know about. They need to know that there was a constant fear on the part of the white establishment that these Africans are going to revolt. Of course, the most famous one is the Nat Turner Revolt, or what we call the Nat Turner Revolt. And then you have other insurrections that were planned, much more massive, and never got off the ground. And that would be, for example, the revolt, the intended revolt by Denmark Vesey in South Carolina, near Charleston, around 1820, 1822. And before then, the revolt that was planned by Gabriel Prosser in Virginia in 1800. Some say it involved 50,000 people. A lot of this, too, I want to say, and I'll let you go on, is that a lot of it was inspired by the Haitian Revolution. We owe the Haitians a lot, and the Haitians have been forced to suffer from the time they revolted. When I was in Haiti, my only visit to Haiti, right before the big earthquake, I spoke at a university, and the university, and after it was over, there was a reception in my honor. And a couple of the university students, a couple of young brothers, maybe about 20 years old, came up to me and asked me, they said, do you think we should have remained slaves to the French? Maybe we wouldn't have suffered so much. That's the degree of suffering of the Haitians. So, you probably know more about Stono and the revolt in Louisiana than I do. And I don't want to come across as being super knowledgeable. Only fools know everything, and if I don't know, I'll be quick to tell you. So you have the edge on me in that regard.
Listen, I'm glad that you said that. A lot of folks would just try to wing it. I'm glad. That's why I always have a lot of respect for you.
I don't like to wing it anymore, brother. And I think it's arrogant when a person acts as though they have all the answers. I think it's a collective effort. I know a lot, but together we know so much more.
Okay. Well, let's go to one of the men that you did mention, because I've read some about him, but that's why I like to talk with historians. I mean, they can bring these people to life. Let's talk about Denmark Vesey, and what you do know about him.
Well, we don't know a lot about him. There's a excellent book. I highly recommend it. It's not a new book, and it's not even written by an African. It's called American Negro Slave Revolts by a man named Herbert Aptheker. And I read that as a university student way back in the 70s. American Negro Slave Revolts by Herbert Aptheker. And he talks about 250 revolts. That's just in the United States. And he documents them year by year and state by state. American Negro Slave Revolts by Herbert Aptheker. But other people have written extensively about Denmark Vesey. It took place in South Carolina. South Carolina and Virginia perhaps have more history. Well, anyway, I guess all the states were, but South Carolina was very, very, very active. And this revolt was planned around 1822 or so near Charleston. It never got off the ground. It was a snitch. It was very, very complicated. One of the problems, I think, with the big revolts, like the Gabriel Revolt and the Denmark Vesey Revolt, is that they were very complex. They involved a lot of people. Nat Turner's revolt was, I think, successful because it only involved a handful of people. There were fewer things that could go wrong, fewer people that would tell the master.
Okay.
Fewer intricacies. So what we know about Denmark Vesey, he was a very dignified man. I think he was a freed slave or former slave, and I think that's important too, that some of these revolts didn't actually involve enslaved people per se, but involved people who had been enslaved or had families who were enslaved or had won their freedom or something like that. And so it's unfortunate that the one that people talk about the most is John Brown. But certainly Denmark Vesey comes across as a very dignified man, a man of great intelligence, like Toussaint Louverture, and it's just unfortunate that he wasn't able to carry it off. But the spirit of rebellion, the spirit of resistance, is personified by Denmark Vesey.
I've read that David Walker and also Morris Brown and several other men was involved with him. They escaped when things fell apart. But, I mean, we've seen David Walker's writings. That group that he had must have been full of intelligent black men.
Oh, big time, big time. One of the reasons I don't spend more time with David Walker, who lived in Boston, by the way, and he had a house in Boston, is because I don't have any images of David Walker. A lot of times when I do my presentations, I do visual presentations and I show pictures. And I don't have pictures of him. Now, there are artist depictions that I use of Nat Turner and also Gabriel Prosser, but I am not even aware of a physical description of David Walker or Denmark Vesey.
Okay. You know what? We're gonna take a brief break, and when we come back, we'll continue the conversation with historian, researcher, and educator, Dr. Runoko Rashidi. And you can give us a call and join the conversation at 215-253-7263. That's 215. Welcome back to Time for an Awakening. And we join this evening in conversation with historian, researcher, educator, and anthropologist, Dr. Runoko Rashidi. Dr. Rashidi, let's get back to what we were talking about just before the break. We were mentioning, and you were talking about Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, and Nat Turner. What really bothers me a lot, Dr. Rashidi, is that, especially in the case of Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, these men were ministers. They were spreading Christianity at the time, and they did what they did because of the dire circumstances of their people. And the overwhelming majority of ministers today act like these men never existed. They don't talk about them. If you go in the average church or talk to somebody and they don't even have to be church-going people. if you talk to the average one of us, they know nothing about these men. Nothing about, and that really hurts me. Talk about it from your perspective of these men being what we know now to be religious men, and they're not even talked about by the religious community now.
Well, you know, religion, like anything else, can be used to advance the cause of our people, and it can be used to retard the cause of our people. Malcolm X was a Muslim. You know, Garvey, towards the end of his life, to my knowledge, became a Roman Catholic. That's hard for a lot of people to believe.
Well, you know what? I didn't know that.
That's a fact. That's a fact. To me, you know, and I get this virtually every time I do an interview, it always comes down to religion, Christianity, and what have you. To me, you can worship a doorknob if you want to. I'm concerned about what you do. Now, if you do something progressive, I'm for you. If you do something that's not progressive, I'm not for you. For me, I'm not so much disconcerted by people who don't know. You know, all of us are ignorant to some extent or another. What concerns me is people who know they don't know and are perfectly content to remain ignorant. That's the scary part. I think that we should always be trying to instill in our people a desire to want to know, a desire to learn, a desire to acquire knowledge and do something with it. Nat Turner was a Christian. Harriet Tubman, who I want to talk about, you know, very soon, was a Christian. But they are not like many of the Christians that we find today. These were activists, and they used religion, you know, Christianity, as a vehicle to move our people forward. You know, the church at one time was a progressive institution. I don't see that anymore. In fact, to me, the black church, speaking generally, is one of the most reactive. It's a disgrace in many ways. You have people whose major intent in life is to make money, you know, prosperity preachers and that kind of thing. You know, I very rarely hear any of these people talk about how do we use the church to advance the cause of our community. It's usually about advancing the cause of the pastor, and that's disgusting to me. And it seems to me that the ancestors will be very, very angry at such behavior because we have pimps in the pulpit. Let's tell it like it is.
Wow. No argument there. Dr. Rashidi, you mentioned Harriet Tubman. She was going to be the next, she was one of the most influential women that we had here, in my opinion, in the country of our former chattel enslavement. But talk about her.
Harriet Tubman carried weapons. Harriet Tubman led, as I understand, the military contingent in the so-called Civil War. Here's a woman without a university degree, wasn't light-skinned, didn't have long hair, you know, very Africoid, you know, who was beaten as a youth, who escaped from slavery, and then went back to get other enslaved Africans, including her husband, who had married another woman. Now, Harriet Tubman was really a remarkable person. She is the most famous conductor, as you know, of the Underground Railroad, and she was famous for saying, I rescued hundreds of my people from slavery, and I could have rescued hundreds more if only they had known that there were slaves. What statement better personifies the struggle that we're waging right now? You know, that a lot of people don't want to hear this black stuff. What you talking about? Life is good. You know, I don't have any reason to resist. I ain't from Africa. You hear all this ignorance. And Harriet Tubman said it. I rescued hundreds of my people from slavery. I could have rescued hundreds more if only they had known that there were slaves. A relatively small black woman, you know, and she is, and a woman at that. I think, again, Harriet Tubman gives us an opportunity not only to talk about resistance, but black women and the role that they played in it. And she was not alone. Of course, you have people like Sojourner Truth, who, when white women were struggling for not emancipation but suffrage, when they were struggling for the right to vote, she is supposed to have said, ain't I a woman too? And you have people like Ida B. Wells Barnett, a little bitty sister born in Mississippi, I think Holly Springs, Mississippi, in July 16th, I think 1862, who was a journalist and a teacher, and she reported on the cases of atrocities, committed terrorism, lynchings, burning alive of African people. This sister would carry 2 and 3 guns around with her. She was a product of her times in many ways. She referred to her husband in public as Mr. Barnett. but she named her firstborn daughter Ida B. Wells Jr. You have Drusilla Dunjee Houston, who wrote the book Wonderful Ethiopians in the Ancient Kushite Empire, the great history book in 1926, but who also covered the destruction of Black Wall Street. So you have many. You have a sister named Mariah Stewart. You have the sister named Mary Ellen Pleasant, who financed John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. So you have a whole string of black women who played tremendous roles in the resistance movement and whose names we need to elevate to godlike status, I think.
You know, you just mentioned the raid on Harper's Ferry. And what I've seen in history, and I'm going to throw this to you so you can talk about it, John Brown met with Frederick Douglass and also with Harriet Tubman on a couple of occasions.
And Martin Delany.
Okay, yes, on several occasions to try to get their involvement with him in Harper's Ferry. And you talked about earlier, resistance takes all forms. We could see reflections now in history that Frederick Douglass or Martin Delany or Harriet Tubman did not get involved in the raid at Harper's Ferry. But we could see that history says that one of Frederick Douglass' right-hand men, Shields Green, got involved. He left Frederick Douglass and got involved in Harper's Ferry and was killed. But it was black men involved with John Brown and his sons at Harper's Ferry. Talk a little bit about that raid on Harper's Ferry. And one thing that, before you talk about that, one thing that I just found out, that the Sons of the Confederacy or something made a big monument to this black man that stood up and ratted. Well, he didn't rat because he was aware that they were coming. That stood up and tried to defend white folks against Harper's Ferry. I don't know his name. His name escapes me. But just talk about that raid. Talk about what led up to that raid on Harper's Ferry, as you know it, Dr. Rashidi.
Yeah, what led us to it was slavery. Africans wanted to be free. And let's face it, there are some white people who have, been active in what might be called the African liberation struggle. Let's give them credit. Mm-hmm. I don't know if John Brown liked black people, loved black people, any of those things, but he thought that slavery was an abomination, and he was willing to fight and, if need be, die for that. You cannot help but respect that.
You know what? I'm glad that you said that. I'm glad that you said that because not only him, 2 or 3 of his sons, they got killed also.
No, I take my hat off to them. I mean, you gotta respect that. But just like you have some white people who have stood on the side of African people, as we know, you have some black people who have stood in the enemy camp.
Yeah.
You have these idiots like Ben Carson today, and this fool on the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas. I usually don't call a lot of black people out, but these are a couple of exceptions that I just can't bypass. So we've always had traitors in our midst. And we've always had a handful of Europeans in our midst who stood up for African people. I would say they are more the exception than the rule.
Okay.
There aren't that many John Browns that we could think of. There are a handful of them, and I salute them. Brother talked about Gerald Massey earlier. One of the greatest, scholars who said Africa the birthplace and Egypt the mouthpiece, but in his book Ancient Egypt the Light of the World. But Massey was an exception to the rule. And we don't want to create the impression that Massey was normal or John Brown was normal. Now, you brought up an interesting point about people like Delany and Douglass himself and Harriet Tubman who weren't on that raid. Mm-hmm. And it could be, just like you have some of us now, some of us believe that Africans are the only people that can liberate Africans, and that there may be well-meaning white people that, in fact, have a role of some sort to play in African liberation. I respect those people who get out there, these white people, when a black person is shot down in cold blood, and will protest and demonstrate against that. But I also believe that there are some things that Africans must do for themselves and by themselves. And ultimately, we are the only ones that can liberate us. Ultimately, we are the only ones that can write the history of African people. And so I'm only speculating, but it could be that that's why we don't see the names of some of our most prominent African leaders who were more actively involved in that raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. But it's certainly a pivotal point in American history. The raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia is the single most important event that led to what we call the Civil War. And I salute John Brown, but certainly we don't want John Brown to obscure the names of the Africans who fought to liberate other Africans.
Yes.
Certainly there were many of them.
Let's, we got about 5 more minutes left. Let's go to 215 area code. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hey, Brother Elliot, how you doing, my brother?
How are you, sir?
I'm doing fine. Hey, Brother Reg.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing fine. Hey, Brother Ralph.
How you doing, Brother Joe?
Hey, how you doing, Joe?
I'm doing fine, Brother Ralph. Hey, Brother Rashidi, how you doing, good brother?
All right, now, you've taken up about 1 of the 5 minutes now, brother.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's all good, Brother Rashidi. I only had one comment anyway. I just wanted to know when you just mentioned about the fools list. You mentioned Ben Carson and Clarence Thomas. Did you mention the other fool? Because I just had to go to the phone to call y'all. Did y'all mention the other fool, Alan West? That's another dangerous Negro.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
man. Oh, let me tell you, brother, that cat is no joke. See, some people think they either take that cat lightly or they're not aware. I tell Brother Elliot and Reggie all the time and stuff, that cat is dangerous. If that Negro could drop a bomb on black folks, he would. That is a dangerous Negro. Make no I want our people that's listening around the country to know Alan West, that Negro is no joke, brother. He got the stain for black people. I just want to put that out there in closing, okay?
All right, we appreciate that. He's a worthy person to add to the list.
Hey, thanks, Brother Rashidi. Y'all brothers keep on keeping on. Peace and love.
Thank you for your call, Joe.
You're welcome.
Brother Rashidi, we're coming up on the top of the hour and end of the program. Before you leave us this evening, it was an interesting discussion, and it can continue on because we missed a lot of people. I'm kind of glad we did kind of target or highlight some of our people involved in the struggle. Before you give out your information again, talk about your future, what you plan to do in 2015, where you plan to go. Oh, but before you mention that, because you talked earlier about your visits to Colombia, and you've seen that our people there were very anxious for a lot of the knowledge and to become more conscious. Talk about, because when you travel other places, besides Colombia and other places around the world, do you see the same veracity of our people to know who they are?
I would say that wherever African people are, the struggle is very similar. You have some Africans who are very, very anxious to acquire knowledge of self.
Okay.
And you have others who are much more complacent. In Colombia, I was inspired by this desire to know. I think that it's possible that we can I think that all people essentially want to feel proud of themselves, that they want to feel like they made a contribution to the world, that they have a history beyond enslavement. And I think that we have a duty and an obligation to try to tap into that. Some of us have closed our minds like we close a window or a door for fear that a new idea might come in. But wherever I go, I also find that there are people hungry for knowledge of self. And those are the ones that we want to tap into. That's our army. That's our base. I think that, as I've said before, what you do for yourself depends on what you think of yourself. And what you think of yourself depends on what you know of yourself. And what you know of yourself depends on what you have been told. We have a glorious history. We have a history of resistance. We have a history of rebellion. And I think that that's something that we can all take a great deal of pride in. For those who want to get in touch with me, again, I encourage you to email me at runoko@hotmail.com, RUNOKO@hotmail.com. Go to my website, a work in progress. It's runokorashidi.com. Or you can always call me at 210-232-7272. I want to thank you, brothers, for having me on again. It's a pleasure to be back. Happy Black History Month 2015. We've only scratched the surface, but I think we had a good discussion, and I'm really, really honored and flattered that you chose to have me on tonight.
Dr. Rashidi, before you go, just give us a little highlight of where you're going to be this summer, this fall, your travels. Just tell the listening audience how they can get involved.
This year, I'm working with an African travel agency. The first tour is to northern and southern Ethiopia. That's in May of this year, begins May 1st. And then in July, I think it's the 8th through the 17th, I have an African heritage tour of Mexico. We see the Olmec heads. Perhaps we'll get to see all of the Olmec heads on this trip. And African heritage in terms of enslaved Africans, Mexico is rich in terms of African heritage. That's in July. In November, I'm taking a group to Brazil. That's the African Heritage Month in Brazil. November 21st, I think, is the day that Zumbi was executed there, in fact. And then in December, I take a group to, God willing, Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia. So again, I repeat, if you're interested in any of those things, please go to my website, RunokoRashidi.com. Email me at runoko@hotmail.com, or give me a call at 210-232-7272.
I want to thank you for being with us, sir.
Thank you. You all take care. I look forward to the next time. Hotel.
We'll take a brief break. We'll be right back. Awakening and Brother Reg, Brother Ralph.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Interesting discussion this evening. Dr. Rashidi. It's always interesting when he comes on. And what can I say? I mean, it speaks for itself. I'm glad that he shares a lot of this information, because it's like a classroom when he comes on. It's always interesting when we bring the historians on. And before this month is out, although we bring historians on any time during the year, I plan to try to reach out to Dr. Brown or one of the other historians and bring them on also to give a little balance, give a little more, go a little deeper. But anything you want to mention before we leave tonight?
Yeah, I'd like to mention that when we were talking about the UNIA earlier, Marcus Garvey, the UNIA off of Cecil B. Moore Avenue in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Brother Battle was a very integral part of the UNIA here in Philadelphia. He transitioned late last week. I just found out on last Thursday.
Okay.
So I'd like to send out condolences to the brothers and sisters at the local UNIA in Philadelphia, PA on Cecil B. Moore Avenue, and also to his family.
Any word on the arrangements or anything of that nature?
No, I have someone that should be sending me some information soon. I'll post it.
Okay. Brother Al, any closing things?
No, everything's good on my end, Elliot.
Well,
good discussion tonight. Really enjoyed it. Wrote down a lot. So good discussion.
I didn't get a chance to talk about your review of Whitewater, but maybe we'll do that next week.
Yeah, you know what? Matter of fact, put it out there to the listeners. If any of them saw that Whitewater, I mean, unbelievable, man. What they're putting on TV as far as propaganda. I think we need Dr. Jared Ball back, because some of the stuff that's coming at our people, man, is a disgrace. You know, and our people think it's entertainment. I mean, they're being lulled to sleep by a lot of immoral nonsense. But they say it's entertainment. So what can I say? If it's entertaining them, I can't say nothing, you know?
I want to thank everybody for participating in the program this evening. Lively discussion as always. And we'll be back next week, Lord willing, to continue on this path towards an awakening.